Welcome to Sculpture Studios. For all you dog lovers out there, this one might be a bit of a handful. We've been contacted by Wes Anson from D Studio, and he's looking to have a giant Yorkshire Terrier created. All we knew at the start was that they wanted something supersized for a super impact to promote the national paper. This isn't just any national newspaper, but the national, with their Expect Big Things campaign. The national media collaborate 21 of the UK's biggest daily regional newspapers into one giant nationwide media proposition. They wanted their dog Tiny from their promotional campaign image brought into 3D, holding a copy of the National in his mouth. From the initial concept stage, we knew that they wanted a dog 3 metres tall and as lifelike as possible given the size. For us, this means carving on a large scale from polystyrene, so here we've begun by gridding up our large 8-foot billets and drawing the peripheral outlines of the dog from front and side on. As with many of our projects where we create something blown up and oversized, we begin by creating a cubist form to get a rough shape. We then start fine-tuning the sculpture down from a hot wire through a variety of tools. It's important to get a good idea of scale at this point in time to work out how much material will be needed later on when we get to the next stage in the process. With all the polystyrene blocks cut, we're using a PU expanding foam to join them all together. We often get asked about the foam we use to adhere the polystyrene or styrofoam together, and it's a no-nonsense foam applied using an adjustable nozzle gun. Though a very useful material to have in the workshop, it's a nightmare if it's handled incorrectly, and a real burden if it gets on your skin or clothes, so use wisely. Here we have Chris Groombridge, one of our freelance sculptors, blocking out the rough shape. He's taking off the harsh corners and beginning to create the contours of the limbs and the fur, ready for Aden to start working on the detail. If you've been keeping up to date with some of our more recent work, you'd know we've been very busy in the studio lately, so we often call in an extra hand or two. But carving's always part of the project that Aden enjoys most, so he never likes to miss an opportunity to get stuck in and to go to work with the polystyrene. The bulk of the material was removed using hot wires first, moving down to knives and nail brushes, and then down to wire brushes. When Aden's happy with the form, the whole piece is sanded down to create a smoother finish on the polystyrene. As well as the dog itself, the newspaper needs to be carved that the dog's going to hold in its mouth, so a rough form of this is created, ready for when the client comes down to the studio. Here we have Wes visiting the workshop for the first time to see the progress of the sculpture, and to discuss any changes that might be needed and the next steps in the process. It's always a good start for clients to come down and visit the studio, as it breaks the ice and lets them have a proper chat with Aden over a cup of tea, and it gives them a chance to look round the studio at some of the other projects we're working on. They can get a real sense for the size and the overall feel of their piece, and rather than simply seeing how everything's going on in pictures, it allows them to move around the sculpture and see everything from all angles. Aden goes through the 2 different finish options that are being considered for this: an airbrush finish where the surface would be hard with just an artistic interpretation of fur, and the second option is extra long faux fur that could be added on for a more realistic effect. For this we needed to outsource, making inquiries to various companies in the hope that they could accommodate our needs. We said we essentially wanted fur as long as Chewbacca the Wookiee from Star Wars, and we'd need it to come in various colours. All the fur that you can see going on here are test samples that the companies have sent down. Another preference to the faux fur over the airbrush effect was that it makes this a nice tactile piece to interact with. As with the majority of our sculptures that are out in the public domain, you can be sure that many will fail to resist the urge to touch a piece like this, and this fluffy nature will only encourage more people to enjoy Tiny that little bit extra. With all the carving now signed off, it's on to the next step of production. We need to cover the entire dog with a sticky back tin foil to protect it from the resin that's going on top. Not always a walk in the park, it takes a lot of time to completely cover something like this, and here we all are cracking on and making sure that every single inch is covered so there are no breaches. With the foiling complete, we're now going over the whole form with glass fibre. The rises and falls of the carved surface and the fact that the polystyrene will be staying inside means that the fiberglass doesn't need to be too thick for it to be strong enough to be out in the public. Keeping the glass build-up relatively thin will also help keep the weight down, so this will make it easier for the client's team to manoeuvre Tiny to the different locations. We're using a general purpose resin as this dog's going to be predominantly used outside, and this works out to be more cost effective for the client. The newspaper, or rather the giant Swiss roll as it looks right now, is given the same foil and fiberglass treatment. Unlike the dog, which is going to be covered in the faux fur, this needs to be sanded back to a really smooth finish before its artwork to look like the paper. For transportation, the dog's breaking down into 3 sections: the body, the head and the paper. We've added tabs around the neck so the head can be bolted in position, and we're installing bolt points inside the mouth for the newspaper as well. With the sculpture being relatively front heavy, what we've actually done is cut a trapdoor in the bum of the dog. This way weights can be added internally underneath the fur and the fiberglass when it's positioned on location, and this will stop the dog from tipping forward if a member of the public decides to pull on the front of the newspaper. Here we're using a contact adhesive to add the fur. We need to make sure the grain is travelling in the right directions, and to make sure every inch of fiberglass has been covered. We've got 3 base colours of fur to start working from: a whitish cream, a darker grey and a black, and this will be the starting point for the rest of the artwork. Here you can see how the sculpture breaks down for transportation and fits back together on site, with the head being bolted on around the collar and the newspaper being bolted on from around the chin. Not only do these joins need to be nice and neat visually, but they need to be really secure as well, as Tiny's going to be moved to multiple locations. The newspaper is now being prepped for decoration. For this we're adding a base white of a 2K primer, and the bold headers are marked out with masking tape for the areas that need painting. It's tricky creating what should be a flat image on a shape that's now curved and flexing, so this takes a bit of working out. Not only is it tricky for the vinyls that need to wrap around the odd shapes, but also the paintwork. Everything needs to look as though it flows and follows the correct contours and lines of the shape itself. The client's had vinyl transfers created of all the appropriate text, and we need to align these and get these right first time, as it's difficult to readjust them once they're on the job. Right, we're putting the vinyls on the outside of the newspaper now. What we've tried to do, we've tried to stay true to the newspaper image, but also more true to the image that the client sent us, so that we definitely get the words on the very front, so we can see old dog, new tricks as much as possible. Due to the spacing of our sculpture and the vinyls, we've got a bit of space left at the back here, but because that's at the back we don't think that's as important. We can probably fill that up with something else. The lady's still got to be put on. It's going to be a bit of a task trying to get her to wrap around following all the contours and the double curves, but we'll see how that goes. Show you the underside. That's the national and the red. The red's all been painted in car body paints, and the white is vinyl that we've transferred on, and we're thinking that's looking quite neat considering it's painted and vinyl. A bit tricky to follow all the curves, but it's going on nicely. This is the largest vinyl that went onto the job, and though this doesn't look like much of a double curve on the newspaper, you can see how tricky it is to apply this 2D image to this relatively simple curved 3D form. The image wants to stay as flat and straight as possible, so we need to make sure the vinyl doesn't buckle and we don't leave any wrinkles in the surface. Everything went on really well in the end though, after a few adjustments and resizing of the image, and we also made a vinyl for Tiny's collar. Though the dog can be lifted by a small team of people, we wanted to make this as easy to manoeuvre as possible. For the purpose of relocation, moving Tiny to and from the transportation that the National are going to be using, we're creating a base with casters on it so the dog can be placed on top and wheeled around. With all the major construction now complete, Aden's beginning to artwork the fur. The idea is to blend the 3 base layers of fur into one another and bring the dog closer and closer to the original concept image. For this, Aden's going to work with an airbrush, and he's using a paint specifically designed for fabrics and other soft materials. Regular paints wouldn't adhere to the fur properly and would make the fur feel brittle and clumped together. This paint allows Aden to add different shades of blacks, greys, browns and various oranges while still retaining that realistic fur texture and not matting it together. The ends and the edges of the newspaper are also given a little artwork, just to add a few more finishing touches to the whole thing. As usual, we take a few finished shots here in the workshop before the sculpture's prepared for collection. It's been known to happen with a few projects in the past that once the job's gone out and left the studio, we sometimes don't hear from the client again about where the sculpture ended up, or even hear about how the project went in the first place. But for this job, Wes assured us that we'd be able to find loads of images online of Tiny being enjoyed out on location. The hashtag #IFoundTiny allowed the job to be shared all over Twitter, and here's just a small collection of some of the great shots from the general public. We always say that 3D advertising is one of the best ways to catch people's attention, and using social media in this way simply boosts this reach even further. It's always an enjoyable project for Aden, creating oversized objects and pop art style pieces of this kind of size, and for one-off creations like this, there'll never be another of the same. It's always double rewarding when we can see a piece of our sculpture being appreciated out in the public like this. We can see that all our hard work over the last few months has paid off. Tiny was used for a good few weeks, moving from location to location in public areas in London and outside the front of businesses and offices, and it allowed for a great photo shoot opportunity. We know that the #IFoundTiny and Expect Big Things national campaign worked well, and that Tiny has now been readopted and rechristened Chip to promote microchipping for pets to help them find their way home. It's nice to see that he's still being enjoyed even after the original campaign was over. We'd like to thank Wes from D Studio for coming to us with the work, and for being so on the ball with getting this project moving along. Please feel free to leave any comments below, as they're always appreciated, and hit the subscribe button for our latest videos. You can like Sculpture Studios on Facebook and follow @Aden Hynes on Twitter, and for more of our work, visit sculpturestudios.co.uk. Thank you very much for watching.